right, switching gears here a little bit. Again, we're moving from this speaker presentation style to a more panel discussion conversation style. So I work in my role as the moderator of this session to share with you how 3 very talented industry members are adapting their management practices in challenging times. So that being said, I would like to first allow each of the panelists to introduce themselves, a very quick introduction, who you are, what you do, starting with Zach Ellis.
Hi, I'm Zach Ellis, Senior Director of Agronomy for Olam Food Ingredients. We manage around 11,000 acres of almonds. We also have some pistachios and just a few walnuts that we're trying to get rid of.
Okay, Wes?
Wes Asai, I'm a grower in the Turlock area, former UC farm advisor for almonds in Stanislaus County, and currently independent consultant and do contract research.
Thank you. And Garrett?
Yeah, good morning. My name is Garrett Bowman. I'm a 3rd generation almond farmer in the Modesto area. I went to Davis and then came back, and we've expanded our operation doing management work on the east side of Stanislaus County and down into Merced County. And we've been involved with almond board projects over the years, including Sebastian when he did his PhD work, and then also a long-term nitrogen leaching study that is ongoing in the Modesto area.
Okay, thank you for that quick introduction. So right now, moving on into the technical questions. I work with these 3 panelists in preparation for this summit around the 2 questions that you can see on the screen. How have your nutrient management practice evolved or adapt during challenging periods? That will be the first question. And or what has been your strategy to increase nutrient use efficiency during this time? And I know each of our panelists here has a lot to share around these questions, so I really wanted to get really quickly into these technical questions. So let's start with Zach. I know you want to mention some things. I understand, Wes, you have some slides that you even want to use to answer that question. But let's start with Zach first. Mm-hmm.
Sure, yeah. So, with the current climate and the almond industry, it's a bad word now to say luxury consumption or an insurance policy. So before, we thought, just in case, we're going to apply these products to make sure that we can assume that we're maximizing our yield potential. Now, we don't have the money to do it. So we really have to be cognizant of what we're applying, when we're applying it, and how we're doing it. So what we've done and what we've found very useful is to focus on variability and really have a realistic approach to what we think we can do in the field and how we think we can produce the most of that yield production within that yield potential on that specific ranch. So a few things that we've done that have really helped us lean up a little bit is increasing frequency. So what I mean by that is, first, in terms of irrigation, increasing our frequency of irrigation. So instead of applying, a 24-hour, a 36-hour, 48-hour shot of water, we're applying 6, 8, 12-hour shots maximum. And what that has done is that's really spread the water out through the week, and it's given us a lot of opportunity to do more high-frequency, low-dose fertigations. And at first, when we started this project 5, 6 years ago, there wasn't the issue that we have now. It was more of just trying to be more efficient and switching more from a soil-based moisture monitoring approach to a plant-based moisture monitoring approach, and really seeing what are the plants telling us when we apply water more frequently. We spread it throughout the entire week. And we quickly saw that the plants, the almond trees, really respond well when we spread that water out over the entirety of the week. And then we have much more opportunity to go in and put fertilizer on, mostly nitrogen, much more efficiently. And we could see that by managing our tissues and looking at our tissues a lot more aggressively and really measuring a lot more aggressively. I think before we would take samples and it would be, every 120 acres we would do a composite sample. We realized pretty quickly that the cost of those tissue samples and going out there and doing those and getting the lab analysis is much less than what it was costing us to apply fertilizer at this huge rate, and really not knowing if they were giving us a response. So as we always hear, and I always say to my managers, if you can't measure it, you cannot manage it. And we've really taken that approach to heart. We've gotten much more granular in how we measure tissues and soils and map things out, whether it's using remote sensing or proximal sensing, or even just regular lab analysis. Then from there, we thought, okay, we know there's a lot of variability in the trees and in the crop. How can we start to slowly cut some of these products down and see what the effect is? And when we started doing that, we realized that, the more frequent that we apply fertilizer within the fertigation system, the more of a response that we see. And I know Devin and Catherine touched on it, these big 4 applications per year, huge slugs of UN32. We moved from 4 applications, 6 applications, to 24 applications, 32 applications. So we're applying from April to July 2 to 3 times a week for fertilizer. And that has shown a huge response. And what initially happened was our tissue levels went through the roof. In April, we would do our tissue sample, and instead of having a 3% or a 3.5%, we'd have a 4% or a 4.5% or a 5% analysis on our nitrogen. And so that gave us the confidence to really start cutting back in nitrogen and seeing how the tree would respond. And we got plenty of growth. We've gotten plenty of yield. Our yield potential has not diminished at all, unless there's weather conditions or things that we can't really manage through the environmental component. But we've seen that we can reduce our nitrogen amounts by 10, 15, 20% without having any effect on yield. And really what we think the major change is managing based on more granular measurement and increasing frequency of application. And to Devin's point, I know Devin, where are you at, Devin? You're somewhere, there you are. You were talking about, how usually we're cutting off our nitrogen in the beginning of June, sometimes mid-May. Well, we have moved that and we've pushed it all the way up until whole split. And I know a gentleman over here was talking about whole rot, and that was a huge concern of ours. And my operations manager came to me and said, Zach, we can't do this. We're gonna have whole rot everywhere. It's gonna be a disaster. And I said, let's start small and let's see what happens and we'll scale it. And after 2 years, he was a huge believer that you can, in fact, if you measure more granularly and you manage it more effectively, push that nitrogen application all the way up until whole split and not have any more whole rot than you normally would. And even being able to cut the amount of total nitrogen, by using those tissue analysis and using smart sampling techniques and making sure that you're understanding where your management zones are, it's really had a huge effect on us. And another component is really post-harvest and making sure that we really take care of those trees after harvest and making sure that our managers are not deficit irrigating to a point where we get massive defoliation. And once we required it, we mandated it. We didn't say, hey, please try to not defoliate the trees. We said, you are mandated to keep the leaves on these trees. And then looking at the July tissue samples and saying, okay, if we have a 2.5% nitrogen level, we're not going to apply any nitrogen post-harvest. If we have a 2%, we're going to apply half the nitrogen that we normally would, of that 20% that we normally do. And by doing that, we've also seen a huge reduction in cost, the same amount of growth, the same amount of production. It's been really good. And I think, you always have to start small. You can't scale this across everything and expect to see great results everywhere. But there are a lot of areas that I feel like we as growers were applying just way too much and doing it in way too large of shots. And the real benefit is a reduction in cost, an increase in yield, and an increase in efficiency. And that's really what has helped us to lean out these times when the industry is just really hurting. And the company that I work for is a big multinational company. They're publicly traded. They don't understand agriculture as well as they probably should. Hopefully there's no other Olam people in here, but they don't really get it. They're used to processing facilities. They're used to commodities trading. They're used to if we push them harder, we're going to get more yields. Environment doesn't care about us doing the best we can in the field, right? And when they come to us with our budget number, they say, hey, you had $10 million last year, you've got 6 this year. Do what you can with it, that's all you got. So we're forced to really make some important decisions and cut in areas that normally we would never want to really cut. But what it's made us realize is there's a lot of areas that we can lean up, and that the measurement component really helps you feel comfortable with changing the management component. With all of that, we've saved, 20, 30% on our fertility budget in the last 3 years by ensuring that we're measuring and we're constantly creating a feedback loop so that we can understand what's happening in the field.
Thank you, Zach. And that was a lot there. So if I can say a little bit in my own words, I think you share a lot of key messages there. Trying to stay away of the luxury consumption, not anymore there, planning the adequate zone, sampling the plant, reading the plant, using sensors to really understand what's going on and get a sense of the variability was another thing you cover. And then you really dig into your experience with continuum versus episodic fertigation. And sometimes, I guess, it takes a crisis or a challenging time to find innovation and solutions. And it really sounds that you moving to continuum have been able to reduce fertilization, increase efficiency, nutrient use efficiency. You've seen it in the tree, in the leaf samplings, and you have also seen improvement in yield. So I think that's really nice, and thanks for sharing those thoughts. So next, let's move to Wes. I know he has another perspective to share. So Wes, if you want to, maybe from there or from here, up to you, pass the slides.
Okay, I'm going to take a little different approach here and cite a couple of examples of things that I've tweaked in our operation to kind of deal with the nutrient application procedures during the year. In my particular operation, as I know many of you have out there, you have multiple types of irrigation systems. My primary irrigation system is a full coverage micro system, and I have a secondary drip irrigation that I use to irrigate between varieties and also apply nutrients. So it gives me a little bit of flexibility to do some of the things that I'm going to refer to here. During the course of a lot of my research trials, we did several hydraulic excavations of roots to see where the root zones are on an almond tree. And it's interesting that, keeping in mind this is a full coverage micro orchard with backup drip, that the majority of the root mass tends to be right in that undisturbed, uncompacted weed strip area of the tree. And logically, to me, that made sense. That would be the greatest place to be applying your nutrients. If you look at when you hydraulically wash the soil, only just a matter of a couple inches below the micros is a very dense network of roots. Below the drip emitter, same thing, and even shallower, probably less than an inch below the surface. And if you look at the type of roots that we see there, they're very dense, thick mats of fibrous white root hairs that are excellent at absorbing nutrients. So logically, that would be the right place to apply it. In fact, a close-up, you can even see better. And these masses are several inches thick. So to me, that made sense where would be the most important place to be putting nutrients. This is a cherry orchard example, same thing. We saw the root masses in the root zone of the berm area. So if this is where the roots are, and this is your orchard, where would you think would be the most logical place to put your SOP? My argument would be where the white stars are versus where the red star is. But in driving around the county and looking at different orchards, this is where I see the majority of SOP being applied in bands anywhere from 5 feet away to 4 feet away from the trunk in some of these situations. And in my mind, I don't feel that was the most efficient way of applying SOP, particularly if I know the roots are in that area underneath the tree. We did a couple of trials, actually 3 different trials, one on the west side, 2 on the east side, with broadcasted SOP. I know that goes against the convention of how you apply SOP, but broadcasted in those zones where we saw the root systems to be. And there are some applicators, and these are the type of applicators that I recommend to my clients to use that actually broadcast SOP as opposed to banding it. And if you look after they make a pass, it does a pretty good job of broadcasting it right in that berm area where all the root concentration is. Now, I will admit that this applies obviously to full coverage micro irrigation. With drip, you'd obviously have to put the material where the drip lines are. But in the case of the orchards I did the trials on, and in my situation, it is micro, so it would make sense to put it in these areas. So again, that's where the roots are. That's where I like to apply it. I'm not sure that the one on the far right is the most efficient way to be applying SOP. The other factor too is the concentration required on those bands is much higher, 2 to 3 times higher to get the same impact as light applications on the berm because they're going right into the root system. The question about fixation, we've been told don't broadcast K because it'll get fixed in the soil and not move down in the root system. I've X'd out a bunch of information here because this is some proprietary research data, but just focus on the SOP levels in the foliage. We were able, with these broadcast applications, able to sustain anywhere from 1.6 to 2.2% K levels in the foliage with broadcast applications. We also followed up with incremental soil samples at 3 different depths, at 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot, right in the heart of that root zone. And same thing with that, we were able at all 3 depths, able to measure increased potassium movement into those areas, even with a broadcast application. In fact, in the nonpareil trial, this was the year after the application, so it went on in the fall of 16, and in 17, in all 3 zones, we were able to measure movement of potassium into the root zone. So at least in my experience with how applying potassium in our situation, I've had no issues with broadcasting it in that root zone area. And in my opinion, I'm getting a more efficient use of the amount of potassium that I'm putting on and spreading that cost over several years versus 1 year with a big financial hit on a large dose of potassium. The last topic I wanted to touch on briefly is nitrogen. Apparently, I took this photo out of the Almond Board Best Management Practice Manual, and apparently it's outdated. I think Catherine showed a newer version that has a little different blue bar on there, but the current one that you have out on the table there has this. And I was going to comment a little bit about how I've tweaked my thinking on this nitrogen application, because if you look at the blue area, which I will admit is where the bulk of the nitrogen uptake for the new growth and new crop occurs, and the brown area where the stored nitrogen is supplying the tree. I mean, I have no qualms about that being accurate data, and I'm absolutely sure that, you know, from a pure empirical point of view, that is accurate information, and it's probably documented with labeled nitrogen and everything. But the reason I put those 2 arrows on there on the different timings is I used to put my first nitrogen on based on this information on that mid-March to early April, depending on the year, based on that 70% leaf out. Well, I was noticing that a lot of other PCAs and a lot of other growers were putting nitrogen on early, like in early February before bloom. And acknowledging the fact that obviously stored nitrogen is supplying the bloom, and that's not the intent of that early nitrogen, but I think the intent of it was to supply nitrogen so that when that first bloom finishes and you're at shuck split or first leaf out, you notice on a heavy crop set year, your foliage comes out yellow. And applying nitrogen at that time is not quick enough to get a response. And in some cases, there's no district water to incorporate it, or it's rained, your soil is saturated, and you worry about phytophthora, and you're not going to be irrigating that early anyway. So you can't incorporate it at those times. So what I've done is I kind of followed what some of these other growers and PCAs have done and shifted some of my nitrogen to that early period before bloom, completely acknowledging it's not servicing the bloom, but it's there and available when that jacket split period and first leaf emergence period comes. And anecdotally, and I have no scientific statistical data to support this, but visually, any orchard that does that, the leaves are much darker greener and the rapid shoot expansion occurs faster. So I've kind of deviated a little bit from this chart for that particular reason. And the question about if you put it on early, it's leaching and there's no uptake. Well, the last 2 weeks of February, in any almond orchard, you can find active white root hairs. Definitely in February, they're already there. So It may not be as efficient as later applications, but there's still the ability to be taken up. And visually, from what I can see, color and vigor-wise, it is happening. So until someone can convince me otherwise, I'm still going to continue to do that practice. Finally, on the flip side, on the late side, I know a couple of conversations came up regarding the haul rot issue. Back when I used to do the 4 sequences of applications, now it's multiple applications, similar to what Zach was referring to. But we used to put anywhere from 3 to 4 applications on a split, and that would require one fairly major dose of N to go on right before hull split, which, at least in my mind, was bad for hull rot. And so we would actually shift that blue curve a little bit to the left, try and cut off in May and coast into June. Now with the multiple light applications, we don't see that. But back in the old days, we would do that, and we would decrease hull rot in conjunction with deficit irrigating at that same time. So that 2-pronged approach to managing the hull rot has really worked for me. And I also have issues with Monterey and Fritz being very late to harvest. So we actually don't apply the nitrogen until right after we shake on those varieties. And you might say, well, right after you shake, how do you do that? Well, my neighbors must think I'm insane, but what we do is we actually, because we have the ability, we'll shake the orchard and send a crew with backpack blowers on and blow each emitter off and then inject nitrogen right after the shaking. And as crazy as that seems, I mean, we can walk an 80-acre block relatively fast basically at walking speed and clear these areas, get our N on right after shaking. If any of you have Fritz, you know you're probably shaking it the first or second week of October. And in my situation, if we put on nitrogen prior to that, it'd be November before I harvest. So we shake it and immediately come behind it, apply our N, and we're able to get nitrogen early enough in the season. There's still a little bit of efficiency of uptake and not getting into that dormant period where we know we're basically not getting any uptake and storage for the following year. And I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Wes. That was a lot. So I will try to also summarize in my own words. I think I captured there. I mean, it was eye-opening to me. Again, emphasizing that we can do everything right in terms of the right time, the right source. But if we don't look into the right place, especially for potassium, we may actually be missing the point anyway. And I really like those pictures that you have at the beginning, those really X-ray, I would call them like graphical X-rays of where the roots are. So connecting the dots to what Catherine was showing, they are really in that shallow zone going down, but also horizontally, they are very constrained depending on your irrigation system. So it's not the same if you have drips, and if not, where you may be banding, but you need to band where the drips are. It's not in the middle of the row as you show. And if you have micros, it looks like you may be able to broadcast a little bit more, have more flexibility as well. So really site-specific considerations. We have guidance, but at the end of the day, it's a side-by-side decision. So to me, that was really eye-opening as well. I think also you mentioned some points about in the search for optimization, when to start your nitrogen application, right leaf out. Maybe that's a point where we have to continue to look into it. And also hull rot is a topic we continue to look into, especially if you have excess of nitrogen application, then we know you have more hull rot. So how do you get with just the adequate amount of nitrogen late in the season is, I think, the point you were trying to make too there. And last note I took, dealing with late varieties, while the guidance may be based on non-pareil, really timing a late variety, it may pay off if you do all those things you were showing, and it's really hard to put nitrogen when you are harvesting in October and the leaves are following, and the efficiency of that application may not be as good. So good points there. Anyway. A lot of notes from my end, but really good sharing as well. So thank you. Lastly, I would like to pass it to Garrett.
Yeah, so my comments are going to follow a lot along what Zach has shared, but maybe more from the perspective of a smaller family farm than a large operation. And so just backing up, kind of looking at the mentality that has driven our operation, you know, and we started seeing the economics start to slide. In our own operation, we started looking at our business as a whole and starting to ask the questions, you know, how are we going to ride this out? Are we going to make big, broad cuts across the operation? Are we going to make small cuts? Are we even going to make any cuts? You know, maybe we just operate in the red for a year or two and hope this thing rebounds and we just ride it out. But it's appearing that we're going to be here for a little while, and operating in the red for a long period of time is not good business. And so then to further complicate that dilemma is, you know, as good businessmen and as stewards of the land, the reality of it is we really don't have the incentive and have not had the incentive to over-apply inputs, even in good times. You know, we're already trying to apply pesticides only as needed, only the right amount of nitrogen. You know, I live in the middle of an orchard. We drink the water that comes from the ground. We don't really have an incentive to over-apply. You know, my kids run around in the orchard barefoot. And so it's not like we're just blowing excess and we've got all this fluff that we could cut off. So as we kind of looked at it, you know, you realize you can fix your red on the income statement with either more yield, more income, or less inputs. And so you're kind of stuck in this problem that decreasing inputs could also decrease yield and therefore further reduce profitability. So we kind of looked at our whole operation with the idea that, you know, we're going to try to do more minimally invasive surgery, realizing there's still going to be a recovery, but not like it would be as if you had a huge incision like open heart surgery where your recovery is a lot longer. So as we dive into like nutrient management, one of the overarching thoughts that we've tried to keep in mind is to try to avoid things like just in case applications. You know, I'm making a trip through the field, maybe a fungicide application, I might as well just throw in a whole bunch of micronutrients because I'm making the trip and just in case. And so, you know, we're kind of going back to what the research is saying. What are our critical values for different nutrients? And if the values are there, we're not going to apply it. One orchard may get things cut, but a high producing orchard, we may keep the groceries to it and not make many changes at all. And so one example of that would be like in post-harvest this year, pulling up our boron samples, our hole levels, and if they were acceptable, we just cut out the fall nutrient spray, something we've always done. But if the levels weren't there, or if the levels were there, we bypassed it. But other fields did receive a spray where the levels were deficient, and it made sense to put it in. It's similar with potassium. You know, looking at our tissue analysis, if levels were good, we didn't do a fall application. And we kind of elected to drag our feet a little bit. We'll see what bloom brings. If the bloom is rough again, you know, maybe we'll drag that application. If it looks like we're going to set a big crop, then we'll ramp it up and try to give them what they need. With nitrogen, we have, I mentioned that we're working on a long-term nitrogen leaching study, and part of that has been the continuous irrigation. And in that ranch, we are starting our nitrogen, you know, in March, and basically applying a set weekly amount all the way up into early hull split, maybe in our area, early August. We're also, we start out kind of estimating our amounts based on historic yield, and then in April, we'll go out, put our eyes on it, actually write down a yield number, and readjust our targeted amounts. And just as a side note, which would highlight the need to have a more scientific way to estimate yield, you know, sometimes you just miss it, and you end up with far more nitrogen applied than you wish. This past year for myself was a case in point. And then finally, Irrigation, we are paying attention to our distribution uniformity, maybe more sprinkler checks. If we want to increase our nitrogen efficiency, making sure that each tree is getting the amount, similar amounts, rather than having one area of the field where your distribution is, maybe you got a lot of leaks and you're putting on more nitrogen or fertilizer than other areas. We do utilize soil moisture monitors. When I make a fertilizer application, I want to make sure that we don't move water past 18 inches, maybe 20 inches. Make sure we just keep that right there in the top and not move that nitrogen past the root zone. And also, as Zach mentioned, we're using, monitoring tree stress, watching that, trying to irrigate to the tree's demand, and also balancing that with what's going on in the soil. Just in a complete effort to ensure that every drop of fertilizer has the potential to be utilized. And again, just as it's been said numerous times today, paying attention to the right time, the right rate, the right place, and the right source.
Thank you, Garrett. Again, a lot of full of good insights too. And you started mentioning how hard it is to be more efficient when you already are following the latest guidances. Even under that context, though, you did brought up, I took note of about 5 different techniques or things you've done to even increase that efficiency further. One of them, custom management. So avoid the just-in-case application, as you were saying. Even in your field, if it's not boron deficiency, don't spray it. So relying more on leaf sampling and other tools to read the trees before, when in a normal year you may have a spray all your field. Custom management in terms of low yielding orchards versus high yielding orchards, dedicating perhaps more effort in those high yielding orchards rather than the ones that are low in these difficult times, where it may be more expensive to bring them up to a speed. Also mention if leaf potassium values are good, you're just skipping the whole potassium application. And during these difficult times, that's a really expensive input, so something to think about that as well. You talk about, same as Zach, continuous fertigation as a great tool for your orchards. And you brought that from a smaller grower's perspective. Zach represents a big corporation with many acres. And the fact that both see value on that is really speak about the viability and the potential adoption of this technique to increase our efficiency. You mentioned the need to predict tools to predict yield early in the season. We're working on that. CDFA show you in the morning. CDFA FREP and ourselves are funding researchers at UC Davis to hopefully find tools to predict yield early in the season and fine-tune nutrient management plans. And ultimately, you talk about irrigation uniformity, that DU test, etc., how critical they are so we can follow the 4 R's. So altogether, I read about 5 key messages from you, same from Wes and same from Zach, a lot of key messages. So thank you very much to all of you. If there is maybe 2 questions that we can take before we move to the next talk, please raise your hand.
What are your guys' thoughts on the new technologies with fertilizers as far as stuff that will stabilize like nitrogen in the soil and make it more efficient to kind of chelate it in the soil so we can take advantage of using less rates? And some of the new technology of some of like the potassium products that they say like 1 gallon is equivalent to 4 gallons of KTS in the soil. So we're using less product but getting more efficiencies.
I think when we increase frequency and we reduce the rate, we kind of slow release it naturally, right? We've moved away from blends. We're very specific on what we're targeting. So if it's nitrogen, we're using UN32 or CAN 17. We're not blending because we know there's a cost to that. If we do need to blend, we'll blend it in the field. But in moving into this higher frequency, low rate type application, we've seen that we're not pushing water. 12-hour irrigation or an 8-hour irrigation is not pushing water very far down the root zone. So in doing that, it's really helped us to reduce the amount of waste. We've also moved to a Mazy-Venturi system. So we're using pressure differential. So if you have a sand media or a disc filter, we'll use a pressure differential between the upstream and downstream, and we usually put a gate valve on the downstream and crank that down a little bit so we get at least 10 psi, and make sure that our pressure differential settings are not so that we're back flushing a bunch. But then we'll use that pressure differential to actually inject a slow amount throughout the entirety of the irrigation. So if we have an 8-hour irrigation, we'll start 2 hours in, and then it will slowly feed the nitrogen in with that Maisie system over 5 or 6 hours, and then give ourselves an hour or two at the end to flush. And so we're really kind of pushing smaller amounts through the entirety of the irrigation. We're using more frequency in irrigation, and because of that, we've kind of moved away from the more expensive type fertilizers. And what was the other question that you had?
I think that was.
Was that it?
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
more of kind of, you hear some of the products like Nutrisorb and stuff like that.
Oh, yes, the potassium. I don't really believe at all that you can tell me that 1 pound of nitrogen is, of a new product is worth 4 pounds of an older product. We look more at distribution uniformity and frequency of irrigation as opposed to trying to lean more on the technologies that salesmen are trying to sell us. And we've tried them in the past when we had a lot of money to do that. None of them really worked, and we've seen a lot more effectiveness by changing our cultural practices instead of the product use.
Any further thoughts from Wes or Garrett?
I just have a brief comment regarding your question on the low rates of products being equivalent. I used to be a naysayer on a lot of these snaky type of products that I was suspicious about. And in the course of doing some of my research trials, it's interesting. There are some things out there that are pretty amazing at extremely low rates. I mean, there was one enzyme that ounces per acre made a statistical yield difference. There was a salt treatment for saline water that we actually had to measure it with syringes and mLs. And it's amazing what some of this stuff does. So, I mean, there's probably some stuff out there that's legit, and I'm interested in looking at some of those things, but there's a lot of stuff that isn't. So I think your question about can something that requires 10 pounds get by with 1 pound, or these efficiency ones, I mean, I think there are some things out there that are legit. Just knowing which ones they are is the hard part.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we have one question there, and then we need to move to the next session. So, Devin?
Thank you. For those of you guys have explored or dove into fully the continuous fertigation strategy, have you guys looked at an economic cost from your operations side of things on whether or not that's a profitable endeavor beyond just the agronomic side?
So far, that ranch is primarily on Nimegard, and we have not, our leaf analysis have held firm. I've not seen them go up to where I felt like I could reduce the amount of fertilizer. I think we are, being more efficient, but not necessarily seeing it in a way that maybe we could cut down drastically. Now, on the hybrid roots, we are. We're starting to see those come up, and so I'm feeling like that they're a little more efficient with the nitrogen. This was a donated system that we're using, and it's about $40,000, I think, is what they quoted me if I was to buy it new. I don't know that, I think we still need to play with it some more to see if we could figure out a way to make that investment worthwhile.
Thank you. Zach, you want to wrap up?
Yeah, we're using the poor man's version, the Maisie system. We get a 2,000-gallon flat bottom poly tank. We feel exactly what we need for that set or that irrigation, so that we don't over apply. Our employees are going to be there either way, so we haven't seen a huge increase in terms of or labor rather. We have seen a huge increase in the headache that I've provided to my ranch managers by doing that. But they see the benefit eventually, and it takes some time. And again, we don't scale it. We don't say, hey, you have to do the whole 2,000 acres like this. Let's start small, give you the proof of concept, and then we can move forward. But as it stands now, and I think we were probably a little bit more of that luxury consumer than Garrett was. So that's probably why we're seeing the benefit a little bit more in terms of the tissues and being able to reduce. But in terms of labor or operations, it's all pretty much the same.
Well, thank you. A big round of applause to our panelists for sharing their thoughts during these difficult times. Thank you so much.